Welcome back to the third and last session of this year's BioLab, to be followed by a social hour. I am Kate Buford, chair of this year's lab, and I am delighted to introduce our third speaker. Yunte Huang is a distinguished professor of English at the University of California, Santa Barbara. We wish to extend our best hopes for any of his friends or colleagues in the Los Angeles area at this terrible time. A Guggenheim Fellow, Yunte is the author of Charlie Chan, The Untold Story of the Honorable Detective, which won the Edgar Award and was a National Book Critics Circle Award finalist. His next biography, and they all make a sequence, as you'll see, Inseparable, the original Siamese twins, was also a finalist for the NBCC Award and was named one of the best books of the year by the New York Times, NPR, and Newsweek. He has published articles in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Chicago Tribune, and others, and has been featured on NPR, CBS, the BBC, C-SPAN, and others. His new book, Daughter of the Dragon, hold on, I have it right here, Daughter of the Dragon, so you can get a visual there, is a biography of Anna May Wong, published by Liveright in 2023, was named one of the best books of the year by the Times, and was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. It is the third and final, I think, unless he writes a fourth, installment of his Rendezvous with America trilogy. Each of these three biographies have the same extended subtitle, Rendezvous with American History. Born and brought up in China, Yunte has taken on in this trilogy a fascinating biographical challenge: how to mark the intersections of three figures of Asian descent in American popular culture and assess their impact on American history. When Yunte and I served on a panel in 2011 at the Los Angeles Times Festival of the Book, I was so taken by the originality and provocative nature of his work on Charlie Chan. Since then, he has expanded and deepened what turned out to be a mission with his subsequent two books. It is a pleasure to welcome him to this year's BioLab. The title of Yunte's remarks is The Chinese Art of Biographical Writing. Yunte.
Well, thank you, Kate, and thank you to everybody who's here. So, like Kate said, I've written three biographies and writing about, three Asian American icons, or four, depending how you count the Siamese twins, because they're so anyway, I don't have a written script that I'm going to read from, but I do have visual aid. So I'll try to, I have notes and thoughts, and but I'm more than happy to chat and, discuss any of the questions that may interest you. So let me bring up share screen. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Can you guys see?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I call this Chinese, art of biographical writing. Like Kate said, I grew up in China, went to college, Peking University. And then, the student protest in '98, I was sophomore in college. And that was, of course, it's an important event in my life. And that's when I decided to come to America. And I came here, and all these years, I've been here over 3 decades. I mean, oof, time flies, like they say. And since I've written this trilogy, now it's sort of like so I'm very grateful to Kate and this organization, for giving me the opportunity to go back and reflect upon what I've done. Of course, nobody will plan this, ahead of time, the trilogy. And, I wrote one book and then the second one and the third. People ask me, did you plan all that? Of course, I didn't. So it gave me an opportunity to reflect on what I really done, how I did it. And so I keep thinking, going back, digging my roots. So what I will do now is to go through like a brief history of Chinese, biography, this genre, and it will take us way, way back, but it's going to be very short. And then I go on to talk about to what extent I kind of learn from this tradition, knowingly or unknowingly. since I grew up there, apparently. But also my struggle kind of against this kind of tradition, and also what I learned from you guys, American writers, and because we are, of course, China and Chinese and Anglo-American tradition are quite different. So anyway, let me get started. So starting with the most basic, the Chinese equivalent for the English word biography is 传 or 传. It translated literally actually means transmission, commentary, or just biography. So some of the modern Chinese words which we still use containing this 传, the word, all refers to transmission. So 传媒 meaning medium or medium of transmission. 传统 meaning tradition is also transmitted. And also legend, 传奇. The English word legend, of course, came from Latin, like legere, gathering, and speak or words, in the sense of oral transmission, kind of handed down generation by generation, like legend. So all these kind of and also there's a 传, if it does not refer to a biography, it's more often used to describe commentaries of canons, such as 左传, very famous book, which is actually a commentary on spring and autumn, a history book edited supposedly by Confucius. The same, another version of the commentary is called 公羊传. It's another comment, set of commentary on spring and all, spring and autumn. So biography then, as 传 as a biography or commentary, as you see, if there are commentaries on something else, it usually means it's kind of subservient, right? A means to a higher end to transmit the great ideas or principles of the canon, which is the word for 经. So 经 and 传, they are separate. 经 is the canon, and the 传 is the commentary, commentary on a person or commentary on a canonical text. But the genre of biography, what we call the dawn of Chinese biographical writing, really came about thanks to Sima Qian, who's a Han Dynasty, historian, usually known as the Grand Historian of China. Right? His most famous compilation was Shiji, Records of History. Poor guy, he was inherited this mantle from his father and trying to complete, finish what his father started out. But he's also kind of very, how should we say it, straightforward person. So he spoke, truth to power, meaning the emperor, and they infuriated the emperor for one particular reason. And so he was penalized, punished. The crime, he was castrated. Basically, they didn't just have him by the balls, literally chopped him off. Suffering great pain and humiliation, he actually went on to finish this multi-volume records of history. And that really the beginning of Chinese biographical writing. So if you look at his, some of the biographies of he literally hundreds of people, emperors and Confucius, famous people and everything, you will find out this kind of dilemma I'm kind of struggling against, struggling with. In a minute, I can talk more about it. So in Sima Qian's, records of history, individual lives, oftentimes you see like illustrations of the greater events or ideals of time. So in a sense, a commentary on something else. So, a person's life story is, a comment on the times. And that kind of, it always goes through. So following Sima Qian's kind of the beginning, there was a new turn kind of in biographical writing, also in the same dynasty, about 2 centuries later, from historicism to regionalism. And that's when Chinese began to compile a lot of regional biographies, like local, esquires and everything. And this equivalent will be like today's like, historical societies like Los Angeles or small town everywhere. I mean, one thing I noticed, America is actually great. Everywhere you go, they always have a historical society that keep the, geographical data, and Chinese was the same, and they started out from the Han Dynasty. In the same period, Chinese biographical writing also kind of got a boost due to the Buddhism's influence, because that's then when Buddhism came to China, and the Buddhist kind of Hindu literature, a Buddhist literature especially, that often have like great elaborations of details and dramatic narratives of miracles and pilgrimages, and continued much contributed much to the feeling and technique of this kind of pre-Tang Dynasty biographical writing. So everything was going well until the Tang Dynasty. It came about, and that's when actually the genre, I would say, atrophied, suffered a decline. It's mostly because of the tightening or the control of historical writing. So orthodox history, or 正史, became a government kind of monopoly, and so as a result, then biographical writing really suffered. It was smothered kind of between historiographical authoritarianism and the literary phantasmagoria. No one can just sit down and say, like, write a history, or even if it's just a history of a person, a biography. And because I often tell my students who want to study Chinese literature or history, and they say, don't study Chinese history because you know why? Because each dynasty who overthrew the previous dynasty is illegitimate, right? They're all rebels. They rise and they kill off the previous emperor, and then they start a new dynasty. And they're deeply invested, especially starting from the Tang Dynasty. They're deeply invested in controlling narratives about their past, legitimizing itself. So history writing, therefore, is tightly controlled. And so biographical writing, then, as a genre, is caught between. And so just give you one example. So for instance, after the Tang Dynasty, since writers, they don't want to shut up. They always want to comment on the past, but they can't really write something called a history, right? So they turn to other genres, such as poetry, very importantly, and travel writing. So travelogue had really flourished in pre-modern China, partly because the writers who want to comment on a place and its history and everything were not allowed to really write this genre called history. And therefore, they often write travelogue, passing. It's actually history passing for travelogue. Now, and that went on all the way till modern China. So we have this very famous saying by Gu Yanwu, who is a Qing Dynasty writer. He says, not in the capacity of an official historiographer, one should not write anybody's biography. So I guess that's quite a warning to all of us. But so anyway, so this is kind of a brief history in terms of the dawn and the rise, and then very quick kind of a decline and atrophy of this genre until today. So for now, I'm going to turn to what I've done and my thoughts about all this these books and the genre of writing and how to write biographies, etc., etc. Now, coming to America, I was also influenced by other traditions and other ideas as to what is biography and how to tell stories, basically. So one important influence on me was actually this Native American tradition. So I was struck by, say, Anne Scott Momaday, right, To the Rainy Mountain, for instance, give you one example. It's poetry, but it's also writing about their past. What I was struck by, To the Rainy Mountain, was this, if you remember, for those who have read this book, published in 1970, I believe, that it has tripartite structure. It's always three parts, okay? So one part, the narrative, everything takes place simultaneously on three dimensions. One is mythological, okay? One is tribal or communal, and one is personal. And Momaday explains, to him and to his fellow Native Americans, because that's how they feel. Anything, any event will take place simultaneously on 3 dimensions. Another example, for instance, because what I'm struggling, what I hint at by going back to the Chinese tradition is this basic problem for any biographer, right? Is to whether a person's story is important by itself or it's merely an illustration of larger his societal kind of picture, right? So between an individual and a society or culture, a larger picture or a small detail, how do we strike the balance? And one way to talk about it is, as far as Chinese is concerned, you can say, oh, philosophically or culturally, Chinese are not into individualism anyway. So, and that's why, any person's story is always part of a much bigger picture, right? And whereas here in the West, kind of rugged individualism is in our heart, it's in our bones. And therefore, a person's story is interesting by itself. So that's really the issue I'm grappling with. And that's why I want to not just go back to Chinese tradition, but also go to other traditions, such as Native American. Another example, very quickly, like Langston Hughes, the African-American poet, the famous poem, Negro Speaks of Rivers, in which he says, I've known rivers, rivers like Congo, he actually never seen. So when I teach this poem, I ask my students, like, how does he know these rivers if he has not known them, has not seen them? Of course, he's talking about racial memory and a collective, experience and memory that you inherit. So when we talk about one person's story, inevitably we have to talk about the community and the tribe, but also other kind of metaphysical and mythological dimensions, which are quite real to the people who believe in them or lived in them. So how do we, describe, take care of these issues? So my other influences, for instance, how I learned to do this kind of writing. When I first started out writing the first book, Charlie Chan, of course I have to look for examples. And earlier, Susan, a previous speaker talks about, find writers that you kind of feel like or you want to model after. My model are two, actually. One is contemporary one is Michael Wallace, actually, the guy who wrote, Pretty Boy or Billy the Kid. When I first read him, partly because we share the same editor, Bob Weil, and when I first read Michael Wallace, he can go on and on, what we call a digression, right? When he touches on a topic, he can go on and pages after pages, very detailed research that may or may not have anything to do with the narrative. And and I was at awe at his kind of the depth of the research and the wealth of the information that seemingly are not related to the story itself. And my other example, and that's better known to all of you, is Herman Melville, the great author of Moby Dick. If you remember the chapters on whale anatomy, and it's very difficult to teach students this book because they are all hung up on the story. And Melville will jump out of the frame and write a chapter just studying the anatomy of whale, which basically have nothing to do, so-called, with the story, with the plot. And I'll come back why I think Melville is doing that. And I learned a great deal from it as well. As a Chinese kind of biographer, I feel kind of sympathetic with what he was trying to do. So anyway, this kind of digression, Melvillian digression, I learned from that as well. So moving on to the trilogy I just did. The first book is Charlie Chan, the untold story of the detective. And of course, I'm sure you guys know this kind of funny, aphorism spouting Chinese detective from Honolulu. And of course, he's a very controversial figure. So when I first proposed to write on this book, um, I understood my own positioning as, kind of self-positioning, because early on, the question was asked about how, can a biographer, where can you situate yourself? Should you leave yourself out completely, or you should put yourself in? For me, it's almost like a no-brainer because taking on Charlie Chan, I'm not strictly Asian American. Right? I grew up in China and came to America, when I arrived, I already came of age, so-called, after college. And but I had this kind of new Asian American experience, working at a restaurant in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, before moving on to Buffalo, New York, and then moving on to Harvard University, and now on the West Coast. I have my own kind of experience. So how do I grapple with this kind of Asian American tradition response to white racism against Chinese or Asian Americans? Inevitably, I have to situate myself somewhere in the middle. I can't leave myself out and produce an objective, description, because the story of Charlie Chang is not straightforward, right? It started out as with Chang Apana, who was actually a Cantonese cowboy in Honolulu, who was behind the fictional creation character, of Charlie Chan. And then we inevitably have to talk about the creator, person who actually was a novelist, Earl Dare Biggers, a Harvard graduate from Warren, Ohio, a young Buckeye in the early 20th century, was inspired by Chang Apana's story, and then went on to create a funny kind of character, and later became, of course, a film icon, picked up by Hollywood. So these kind of different layers of this American story, to quote Charlie Chan, is like, truth is like a soccer ball, right? It receives many goal kicks before reaching goal. I need to kick this ball over and over again in order to get to what I want. And inevitably, I have to go through and at least, tell my own story, how I came to write this, this book. So it's somewhat memoirish, I think. That it's inevitable I put myself into the book. So after this book came out, for instance, I gave many talks and went to many events, including the one where I met Kate. So one of my stops was in a City Light bookstore in San Francisco. And of course, that was right in the heart of Chinatown. And I was a little bit, concerned, worried that evening, because Charlie Chan was very offensive to most Asian Americans. And these films, for many decades were banned, basically. And Asian American community often protests against any screening of Charlie Chan films. So I was a little bit concerned, for having written this book and now going around giving talks. But at the end of my talk, one of the older Asian Chinese American kind of from the community came to me, and he shook my hand and said, "Well, thank you for writing this book." He said, "Because we cannot write this book." Okay. I immediately realized, of course, I mean, if you were to, if you grew up in America as Chinese American or Asian American in the 50s and 60s, right? Your neighborhood kids will come to you and imitate Charlie, do Charlie Chan imitation to you, and then call you, names, etc., etc. You're definitely gonna hate this character, even the name. So inevitably, I need to understand, that kind of history, and but of course, that's also to me, this character is interesting because it really tells me about America, right? That the racial humor or kind of racialized humor, it really lies at the heart of American culture, kind of racial mimicry. So you cannot separate, the baby from the water, bathwater, or you cannot separate this flower from its toxic soil. And so that interests me. So that's really the complexity I have to deal with. And from Charlie Chan, I moved on to Siamese twins, and briefly their story. They were actually Chinese. Their father was actually a Chinese immigrant to Thailand, so Siam at the time, and they were born, with this band of flesh joined at the base of their chests. So they came out this way, and they eventually died the same way, never separated from each other. But their story, you grew up in a fishing village in Siam, and until they were about 14, they were discovered by a Scottish, businessman who saw a golden opportunity and to make some money out of them. Because at the time, freak show in early 19th century, freak show was really a big money maker, especially in the United States. United States was a boring Puritan country, You can't drink, you cannot have theater and all of that. All the early European, travelers coming to America, they all say how boring America was, right? So Freak Show was like the film, going around, entertainment, mass entertainment. And so Robert Hunter, the Scottish businessman, bought basically Siamese twins from their mother, for $500, and then shipped them to Boston, historic harbor, and then paraded them through, out the country and the world, going to England and everything. So they slaved, Chang and Bunker, these two boys, slaved and made a lot of money for their owners for 3 years. But they are very smart. That's one of the reasons I was attracted to their story is that when they turned 21, they broke free from their owners. Basically, they wrote a letter, kind of their own Siamese, Declaration of Independence, say, "Fuck you, we are done because we are now 21. You don't own me anymore." And so they broke free, but they ended up, keeping the same manager who will now work for them. So they continue to display themselves, except now they're making money for themselves. And they suffered all kind of humiliation because a freak show, they're treated as freaks, subhuman, but they knew exactly what they're doing. They just took your money. They will just take your money and be insulted by you. After about a decade, they really made tons of money. And of course, they got sick and tired. And they eventually retired very comfortably to a small town in North Carolina, Mount Airy, which is also the birthplace of Andy Griffith. So Maybury, for instance, it's actually the same place as Mount Airy. And that's part of the story. Eventually, I work into the book. These are kind of American obsession with abnormality, but also the cleanness, right? Andy Griffith supposedly is kind of lily white town, but underneath is actually the Siamese twins. And in this small town, their story took a very, kind of problematic turn. Is that they managed to marry two white sisters. They were really, well-known celebrities. So they managed to convince two white sisters to marry them, and they ended up having 21 children. So, you go figure, they got really busy. It's even more than French term ménage à trois. It's more, it's four actually. But then they started trading slaves. Okay. So, and this is what, the complexity of the story. They traded slaves, they will buy slaves and raise them at a young age. They will raise them, use them until they're 18, and then they will sell them. So when Civil War broke out, imagine which side they stood. Of course, they stood with the Confederacy. And they sent actually the two of their elder sons to the battlefield to fight the damn Yankees. And but financially, they got wiped out. They after the Civil War, they lost all the slaves, and they also lost all their investment in Confederate bonds because they thought they would make money from the Confederate bonds. But after that, it's just worthless. So this is what we called in this picture, there's no black and white, right? Just like Charlie Chan, I'm working against this idea of political correctness, right? Because to ban Charlie Chan, to me, is counterproductive. Just like taking the N-word out of Huckleberry Finn. You don't respect the richness of history. You don't really learn anything from it. With the Siamese twins, for instance, we often think, they're treated as freaks and subhuman, pity on them. But actually, like I said, they're very smart. They would know what they're doing. And the fact they turn into slaveholding, for instance, this is what really, Primo Levi once said, the gray zone of humanity, right? When the table is turned, when Primo Levi was in the concentration camps, what troubled him more was not because of the Nazis who want to kill you. He knew that Nazis would want to kill you anyway. But what troubled him even more is his fellow inmates, giving up an opportunity, they will turn on each other, okay? Or the victim often, when the table is turned, will become the victimizer immediately on a dime. And that's what really kind of fascinating with that story. But ultimately, what I learned from, the Siamese twins biography is really, what it means to be human in the sense of that because they were never separate from each other. For them, being human always means to be with others. You're never on your own. And that's something I learned from them, but also in the sense of the the key issue for Chinese biography, for instance, is about, the individual with the collective, is whether you or others are more important. So finally, the last one with Anime Wang story, once again, I'm tackling with this kind of somewhat controversial figure, because there's always what I call her kind of tortured legacy, right? On the one hand, she suffered all kind of prejudice. She's Chinese, and therefore, there are limited roles she could play, despite the fact she's really talented and really beautiful. And she could never get married because of the anti-miscegenation laws and all that. So how do I kind of, tackle these kind of controversial legacies? And so now I'm going to talk about, for instance, how do I deal with some of the facts? Okay. I feel very odd to say, having written like, at least 3 biographies, I feel like I'm not really, may not be cut out for this genre, partly because that one person's, for all the reasons I will really explain, kind of theoretical and personal, and that one person's story per se does not really interest me that much. But the backstories always do. The stories behind their stories always do. Let me just give you one concrete example. So Anime Wang, after she failed to get a big part in The Good Earth, okay, the big China film that year, she was heartbroken and she was pissed off. And she was snubbed again by Hollywood. So she took off. She went to China for kind of her soul-searching trip to rediscover her Chinese soul, so-called. And in Shanghai, she was treated like a royalty. She was a big star. But she could not get into this private club called American Club, okay? Because Americans would not allow Chinese to go into their club. And she was invited by a friend who was a club member, but she was denied entry. And of course, ordinary biographers will pick this up, of course. And if you look at other biographies of her, it's there. But no one really tells us, and that's what I discovered, and that's why I spill more ink on, is who told this story. It turns out the story came from Emily Hung. I'm sure many of you know Emily Hung, who was a big-time China staff writer for the New Yorker. I think she worked for New York for like 70 years actually, until she was like 90. She was from Missouri, and she was globetrotting in the early 1920s and 30s. And then when she arrived in Shanghai, she really kind of fell in love with the city, and she stayed on, had a Chinese lover. But she also, her most famous sentence from the piece she wrote for New Yorker was about opium smoking. She said, "I went to China because I want to smoke opium." It's very kind of, taunting kind of headline, beginning striking first sentence. And that story, Anime Wang's, the anecdote came Emily Hung. So for me, who's more interested in backstory, inevitably I learn from Melville's to digress, to go into Emily Hung's story, because who told this story is actually sometimes to me is as fascinating as Anime Wang's story, because that's the backstory, right? So let me give you another example to contrast. So there was this story. There was a Chinese driver driving in American street, and he probably ran a stop sign, and so he was pulled over by a cop, American cop, and the policeman asked him, like, "Did you stop at the stop sign?" The Chinese driver, rather than answer the question directly, he went on to say, "My name is like Yunte Huang, I have 2 children. My daughter was a great student. She went to Harvard. And my son is now high school, straight A student." To the American policeman, he is avoiding the question. So the policeman asked again, like, "Did you stop at the stop sign?" And he still didn't answer the question. He went on to say, "I'm a very good, I'm a distinguished professor. I never gotten a ticket, and I pay all my taxes." So eventually the policeman got really frustrated and said, "You didn't stop at the stop sign, did you?" And immediately he panicked. He said, no. Well, actually, he's a Chinese speaker, so no means actually no, I did stop at the stop sign. But the English speaker, no means to a rhetorical question. If you say no, it means you did not stop at the stop. So all the issues came about. The reason I say this is that the backstory here. So to the Chinese, what is a fact? Whether or not you stop at the stop sign, it's a fact. To a policeman, it's a fact, right? Just answer the question. But to the Chinese driver, what is factual is actually about who you are, what you have done, because whether or not you get a ticket has to be, factored into all the big questions like your community, who you are. As a matter of fact, on American street, I mean, if you get pulled over, if you're African American, you know what's going to happen, right? So it's not a question of whether or not it's a fact, right? So the backstory, who you are, and how do you to an American policeman, it's total digression, like who you are, how many children you have. We don't give a fuck to what you're saying, but actually, as we know, we learn the backstory matters a great deal. So for me, as a biographer, like I'm constantly struggling with these issues, and I have the justification of say, going to Melville, going to Michael Wallace, and all that. But ultimately, I'm going back to the Chinese root in the sense of whether an individual story versus a collective and a kind of community's story. So let me just conclude with this. As a biographer, we kind of work between what a historian's, a history is, as an art of writing, with fiction writing. And here I want to borrow from again Melville's phrase called the deadly space between. He says between the documentary and the fictional, there's a kind of deadly space between, kind of in-betweenness. So on the one hand, we have what historians kind of search for causality, explanations. How do you explain? So like I was asked on NPR, how did you explain the Charlie Chang phenomenon, how it came about? I had a very difficult time answering that because that's not the kind of way I think about things. So a historian search for causality, and then a fiction writers, writers look for, I would say, narrative coherence, right? Coherence. Because when we are faced a person's life, it's very rich in detail. How do we try to explain things, or do we try to apparently we have to craft a narrative, right? So one reason, for instance, Melville turned against fiction writing eventually was what in literary history is very famous, called Melville's quarrel with fiction. Because as you know, he started out as a writer, and then Moby Dick flopped, and then he basically turned against fiction writing and went on to writing really long meditative poetry for a long time until his late years. He came back to fiction writing like Billy Budd and all these short stories. The reason he turned against fiction writing was because he does not trust the narrative closure. He calls a confidence game, right? Confidence game, because as a writer, we need to gain the confidence of our readers, right? By putting myself into the book, of course, I try to gain. We have to admit, frankly, we all try to gain readers' confidence, and that to him, to Melville, is kind of, it's problematic. It's our art, but we have to also be skeptical of this kind of the toxicity. It's toxic in some sense. To quote another kind of author, Clifford Geertz, an anthropologist, who once said, coherence, he said, nothing is more coherent than a paranoid delusion or a swindler's story, right? A paranoid, when you smoke a lot of pot, you can see all the connections, or a swindler who tries to sell you a thing. I mean, we have, just had the election. Every election is a confidence game, as you know. Politicians, democracy. If you look back, a lot of the early kind of American writers like Hawthorne, Melville, and all these people, at the time of the rise of the Jacksonian common man, they're always very skeptical of democracy because as writers, they knew how powerful narratives are, stories, right? Earlier, Jack, the keynote speaker talks about stories, theory can never convince anybody, right? Rationality, you can't convince anybody. It's always the stories that will. But yes, we have the tool, powerful tool, stories, but we also have to be kind of careful about this kind of, any coherent stories oftentimes is a confidence game. So to me, I think the autobiographical writing is really, between historians search for causality and the fictional writers, search for narrative coherence. I think lies this deadly art of biographical writing, and because we are somewhere in between. So with that, I'll pause and will love to have a chat with you guys. Let me stop sharing now.
Thank you, Yunte. That was fascinating. Golly, my head's spinning. Let me check the, I have some questions myself, and then we'll open it up. You've sort of alluded to this, but this is, of course, about craft, and you've addressed that in your remarks. But what particular differences, when the actual act of writing biography, putting that together, do you see between Chinese and Western biography in terms of craft?
Yes, so Chinese fictional writing, at least traditional fiction writing, is often very episodic. And I'm into like detective fiction, like Judge D, Judge Dunn, D and everything. The earlier, this, who was the guy? Anyway, let me answer it this way. Pearl Buck, who won Nobel Prize for The Good Earth, and claimed that she learned a great deal from Chinese narrative, fiction writing, including biography, is that Chinese are always into separate details, kind of scattered details. They give you a lot of names, and they don't always kind of cohere, and lead you to your own kind of device oftentimes. And that's really, that's why I talk about this anecdote, kind of Chinese driver, like the way his mind works. And so sometimes I ask myself, like my penchant, when it comes to the difference between Chinese writing, storytelling, and American story, of course, to a straight extent, I mean, we live in a global age, most contemporary Chinese who are quite comfortable with Western way of storytelling, the films and novels and everything. So inevitably, but deep down, there's a level of comfortness, right? So if you digress too much, where do you end, right? And so in terms of like actual difference, that's the question I ask myself. Because if you go on like Amazon, what the reader comments, some of them will say like, this guy doesn't know how to tell stories at all. Coming in my book, like, okay, I think I see where he's coming from, because they're so impatient to get the story. And for me, I'm a very impatient myself. My nickname among my friends is VIP, meaning very impatient pig. I'm very impatient, but on the other hand, when it comes to stories, I want to digress, not because I want to digress, but because I really think the backstories are important. Okay, I will get to my point, but you need to walk with me, to walk with me like through all these alleys, back alleys in Chinatown, soup alleys, until I take you inside the restaurant. Because without that, then, I can just take you straight to the fast food, and we'll be done with. Then what's the fun, right? So I asked myself, is that something I learned from the Chinese tradition, or is that something also learned, say, writers like Melville, for instance, and so I'm not very clear as to where I draw the line. Right?
Maybe it's like chicken or the egg. I mean, you're drawn to Melville because of.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Right.
Right. Let's see. Susan Wider asks, Yunte, has it been easier to find source material for your books in English or in Chinese?
Oh, it really depends, really, today. depending on the like Anime Wong, for instance, because she's Chinese and Chinese American, so there are resources on both sides, right? But then, of course, also depends on where you do the research today, right? So if I go to China to dig archives, the other problem is getting permissions as well. So it's not just a question. For me, copyright is actually more problematic than actually finding things, especially when it comes to images. I mean, images, forget it. This copyright issue. And again, the other question is access today, right? TikTok is going to shut down tomorrow. But if I were based in China, now I have a very difficult time, say, accessing national archives. National archives are like websites closed to China today. And the same if I were based in China, the same if in the United States, of course I can go into certain websites, in Chinese websites, for instance. So it's very hard to say. Depends on the subject. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's see. Hold on. Crystal Boyd, Consulting LLC, asks, I hope I'm hearing this right, but thank you for sharing that you're more interested in the backstory or the community than the specific individual. When it comes to writing about the community, how do you determine who to speak with? Is there a danger of leaving someone out or relying on someone who others don't see as a leader or an authority for that community?
Right. Well, community, I mean more in the sense of say, for instance, to write about Anime Wong, or let's say a little about Charlie Chan, the Honolulu Chinatown, of course, the history. But I also need to deal with, say, indigenous Hawaiians, their history. But these are not really contemporary, things, right? There is of course, whose version of history and how do you describe? For instance, I got into trouble one time for writing about, the Captain Cook, the incident. Apotheosis Captain Cook, he was recognized as Galano, and it's still a controversial topic for anthropology. Even did the natives are the natives so stupid not to recognize a white man? Actually, is not a god, or was Captain Cook so devious that he will play along as their god until he was cannibalized? So the key issue is cannibalized, whether or not Hawaiians cannibalized Captain Cook. So I wrote a sentence sort of like as a joke, as a humor, but it's very dangerous. That I say something like after Hawaiians cannibalized Captain Cook, and of course I got a very angry note from a communal member say we actually it's not true, right? Things like that. Yes. So, but most of the time I'm writing about a communal history. Like Los Angeles Chinatown, 1870 Chinese massacre, and that was 3 years before Anime Wang's birth in a laundromat in Los Angeles, or the laundry business. And these are what I mean by communal, not just a person's story. Because to understand Anime Wang, I went on to write a whole chapter about laundry, Chinese laundry, because her father was Chinese laundryman, and how far you can go, how deep can you go, into this laundry business. Actually, you can find a lot. So to the reader who's kind of impatient and said, this guy doesn't know how to tell stories at all, yes, I went out of my way to describe the whole history of Chinese laundry in America. If you're not interested in that story, rather than just straightforward personal story, then apparently I'm not the kind of writer you want, right?
That's fascinating. Tracy Floriani asks, if possible, could you speak a bit more about what you've learned on the how-to of handling digressions from the main figure of the book? Are there certain rules for yourself or questions you pose as you find yourself digressing?
Right. Great question. So the idea how far you can go on a tangent, right? And I teach like that too. So I got comments from some students. So I always prefer the students who fall asleep in my class because they don't really care. They wake up, I'm just the end of the story, and then they're happy and they go away. So they never need to make the connection. They will always blame on themselves for not, making the connection. So I think, once again, earlier I talked about this confidence game. We have to be honest. We try to gain a reader's confidence the same way politicians want to tell you a story, the pitch, and then, whatever kind of how it works on the reader. So it's tug of war. You don't want to wear out their patience, apparently, but you also want to, go deeper into what you're really interested in, what you think, is important. You need really you have to do. I think my kind of rule of thumb is this: is that I would do it at the risk of alienating some readers as to how far I want to digress. Like this laundry business. Like Melville, I want to write like a scholarly chapter almost on laundry, Chinese laundry, describing the laundromat, and the secret, cabinet and all of that. To the sense of like, if you're not into the story, you can always skip the chapter. So I'm not like, that's why I said maybe I'm not cut out for this genre, because I don't just want to tell a straightforward story, like, from cradle to grave. Because like I said, it's what happened outside the story sometimes is more important. So like I said, I'm willing to take the risk. And of course, my editor can come back and say, oh, this is too much, Yunte, and I'm also working with a great editor, and who sometimes allows me to indulge myself a little bit, I guess. It also depends on of course, the editor, right? It's not just you doing writing, depending on how tolerant they can be.
Yeah. Let's see, Anne Fernand. I think everyone's interested in this idea of digressions. Thank you so much. It's a really interesting idea. Thank you so much for this thoughtful chat. I love the justification of digression. I love digressions and I write them all the time. My question has to do with working with Chinese and English sources. For the collective biography I'm writing, one of my subjects is Eileen Chang, Zhang Eiling, who wrote in English and Chinese. Does that ring a bell to you? I have a little Chinese, but will never attain fluency. How do you recommend I think about attaining the expertise when I won't be able to read it all? The answer to me does not seem to be not to talk about Chang at all.
You mean the Chinese writer Eileen Chang?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's one. Yeah.
Right. So translation. It's a question of translation. A subject apparently fascinates me. I'm translating myself to you right now, and I'm translating, you for myself. So once again, if I can give you a story. So Jerry Rothenberg, a great poet who unfortunately passed away last year, known for ethnopoetics, right? In the 70s, Jerry Rothenberg and my former mentor from SUNY Buffalo, Dennis Tarlock, they started a whole kind of poetic tradition or movement, kind of ethnopoetics, is to translate mostly from indigenous kind of poetry, oral poetry, into English. And Rothenberg was doing was translating from Navajo horse songs, Navajos before they, do things or go to war, they do certain dances. So one of the dances is the horse, horse dance, horse song. And Rothenberg did a great job actually translating acoustically by sound from Navajo. Until one day, a chief of the Navajo Nation said, well, Jerry, what you're doing is really great. You're translating, done a great job translating these songs. And the chief said, but I don't want you to translate too much, because I'm worried that the songs will get lonely by traveling so far away from the tribe. Okay.
Oh.
So going back to the Chinese source and how do you get a sentimentality, how close you want to get. And Rothenberg eventually, this anecdote will lead to his idea called the total translation. In order to understand, really translate a simple song, a horse song, dance song, I mean, ideally, you have to translate the entire society. the total, total study, the way they dress and the food they eat. And of course, it means you have to go native in a sense. And that's the extreme, like total translation. And the same, I mean, I would say, any advice I can give you as far as, how close you want to get to the other culture is to live in it, right? Try our best. I spent 30 years living in America. I'm lucky that I started out from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, rather than New York City. So, I learned, came to America through the back door to some sense. So I feel fortunate. Although those years struggling in Tuscaloosa, I was totally disoriented. Like, this is not America I was looking forward to, but I learned from it and go through the experience. Another example, for instance, I guess, one of you may ask, like, what's your next book? So I'm working on I have lived with these stories for over 40 years, I guess. I'm writing like a sort of like Sheila Anderson's, Winesburg, Ohio, these link stories about small town, very weird stories. So I grew up in a small town in China, and many of the things that happened during my childhood, I wanted to write about them, but I always held them onto them until I guess not my English, not in the sense that I'm competent enough to write, in these stories in English, but more in the sense I have lived with these words, English words and phrases, expressions for, uh, for many years, long enough. It's not a word I just picked up, and I can use, but it's the ways of I think in English and all that. Finally I'm reaching a point, say, sentimentally, kind of in terms of sentimentality, emotionally, intelligently, that I'm these words will be the equivalent of, say, the words I might use in Chinese, to describe those events or those characters. So it's like wine; it has to sit for a long time, and to a point that you're really comfortable to enjoy. So in a sense of how close do I, because I'm writing about Chinese events, characters, things that took place in Chinese. Google Translation can help you, or AI can use these words, but my a person's relationship to certain words, vocabulary, it will take years to develop, and there's a certain kind of intimacy that needs to grow, to a certain level. Then you feel confident to use them to describe other memories that are also equally intimate to you. So this, you can't just pick up a word and just go on and use it. It's
There's
like a
several other
long-winded way of answering that question.
It's okay. Digressions are okay. um, there's other questions, but I just occurred to me. Didn't you translate Ezra Pound
Yes, I did.
Chinese into Mandarin?
Yes,
What
cantos.
was
Yeah.
that like?
Say it again.
Speaking of words.
Right, exactly. Yes. Yeah. Well, that's the other thing I learned from Ezra Pound is the imagistic connections. These cantos is basically a series of images connect together, right? They're discrete. It's not like how much pot you have to smoke in order to see the connections, but actually, if you can figure out the connection, that's what the poetic is, right? So to answer another way of questioning, like about digression, in a way, that's the other thing I learned from, like I said, from Pound, was the connection. That if you cannot see the connection, you'll think I'm digressing, but I'm willing to take that risk.
Teresa Anderson asks, did you reach out to family members of your subjects? If so, did they participate in the project to any extent?
Yes. So this is like a key decision I made. Working on the Charlie Chang book, and the Anime Wong book. With the Siamese twins book, I did actually try to reach out. That's the only time I actually try to reach out to the family, the descendants. Partly because Siamese twins, they had a very famous descendant. It was Alex Sink. Alex Sink, she almost became governor of Florida. So I watched her debate with, Rick Scott at the time, in 2010, I believe. And so she lost by like very small margin in Florida, and she ran for Senate. And she was the great granddaughter of one of the brothers. And when I saw her on CNN, immediately I wanted to interview her, but she would not, grant me the permission to interview, of course, for obvious reasons, because she did not want people to think of that connection, calling her, descendant of freaks, etc. She was living in Florida, but also there's the slaveholding, prop legacy as well, and all that. So for all these reasons, but to answer your question, I actually didn't reach out to the descendants of Anime Wang or the Changapana descendants, partly because I'm somewhat like a skeptical. I do understand the importance, like the family memories of this, the people you're, trying to tell stories about. It may be worthwhile to interview them. But then I don't really trust, because that involves another kind of storytelling, because let me put it another way. I trust what I see on paper, or I mean, trust in the sense I work with the materials available. For instance, newspaper articles, Siamese twins, of course, there are so many newspaper articles, published while they're going around. And as you know, like just with newspaper articles today, many of them are actually fictional lies, right? So do you trust the source? Actually, in that case, you need to quote from those newspapers, because those are public perceptions, despite the fact they're not factually accurate, but that's part of their story. So in other words, we also need to incorporate lies, about these characters, because that's really part of their story. You can't just say, oh, this is newspaper, this article is totally fictional. But actually, it's the fictional thing that's very influential, shaping the life of the characters you're trying to describe. So in that sense, family law is part of it. But I never really took the step, because I really want to talk about the public kind of perception of like Anime Wong. I mean, the family will tell you different stories, yes, maybe, but I'm really working on a more kind of public sentiment, the public story of this person. So once again, going back to the individual versus the collective, and I'm somewhat leaning more in the sense of the collective, picture of this one person, if that makes sense. Yeah, but I always do this. I have a ritual with every biography I'm done. I have one ritual, is to go back to their origin, just like Susan earlier talked about, the feeling, right? How do you feel? Imagine where so for instance, with the Siamese twins, because their farms are still there, and now today it's turning into Maybury camping ground. So I will, when I'm almost done with my book, I will travel, to Mount Airy, and I camp out at their farm, because I wanted to feel, despite the fact it has been like 150 years, but the landscape, the geography, the weather. I want to see the trees. I want to see the moon rising on their farm. The sound, at midnight, and the temperature and everything. So I'm somewhat still believing that kind of feng shui, right? Is still there. So with every subject, like Anime Wang, I did the same. Going to her grave in LA. Visiting her old houses. But this is usually done actually toward the end of my writing. And I want to kind of get a sense of aura in there, rather than going to their family members.
Well, I was thinking too of your subtitle, Rendezvous with American History. That sort of says it too. You're really not, that's your focus. That's your tangent, right?
They are meeting with American history, where they meet. And I want to get there and see the crime scene to some extent, solve that mystery.
Let's see. Diana Parcel. Hi, Diana. You refer to digressions. Isn't this really about context, historical, cultural, etc.? I'm thinking of how Caroline Fraser's Laura Ingalls Wilder biography had huge amount of introductory material on frontier life on the plains, terrific info on the geography at heart of the story. So what is the distinction between digression and essential context?
So the easiest, the shortest line between 2 points. You know what I mean? I mean, the shortest distance between 2 points, it's not a direct line. It's a digression. That's, sorry, it's a joke, but actually it works as well. Because that's what politicians do. When the politicians cannot answer the question, they digress. They talk about something else. You just kill the time, right? That's a digression. But that's not really what I'm trying to get at. As writers, the shortest distance, just like I said, taking you to a Chinese restaurant, how you get in, whether you go through the front gate or you go through the kitchen, is actually very different, right? If you just walk in the front, through the front like everyone else, yes, you get a regular experience. But if you know the owner, they take you through the back door, go to the kitchen, see all the nitty-gritty, messy kitchen where they came from. Of course, you may feel gross out, but on the other hand, you get a different kind of experience. So as to whether or not it's the context, or in that sense, is that a context, like what you're eating coming out from the kitchen, or you actually go through a different kind of experience, right, with what you eat. So it's very difficult to say, whether it's the context or it's just a real digression. Because to me, that's, it's hard to say what the real digression is. Right?
Mhm. Pat Lawrence asks, identity. What is your view of non-Asian authors writing about Chinese figures? That's a hot issue. What kind of background qualifies a biographer? In my own writing of a group biography about the relationship between two literary communities, Bloomsbury and China, my position was often challenged by Asian critics in America and China, reviewing my proposal and then the published book.
Right. So it's very difficult to say, how should I put this? So earlier I talked about, my kind of issues or dilemmas or plight or what I'm struggling against, writing things about like Charlie Chan or Siamese twins or Anime Wang. Well, I'm Chinese, but I'm not Chinese American, if you know what I mean. I'm closer maybe than many of you are to the Chinese American community, but I'm not really an insider in a sense. So how do I, work with that? It's the same to answer the question then. Yeah, you will get pushback because Anime Wang faced the same thing. She was Chinese American, but when she traveled to China, whether or not she can be accepted as Chinese was also an issue for her. And so in that sense, that's why you're self-positioning, I guess, sometimes self-consciously, kind of how do you assess what you're doing by thinking about who you are and what you are. Because the sense of objectivity is, of course, in writing, it's really kind of problematic, right? I talk about confidence game, the coherence, it's the same thing, the sense of objectivity. And how do you, because it's really, if you think you're just telling this story without implanting yourself into the story itself, that's ventriloquism. It's it's not true. It's fictional. So we kind of have to be honest with ourselves and anticipating pushbacks in like the person who asked this question is of course it's totally it's normal, I would say. It's a question of how should I put this? Another way to answer this, it really depends on who your readers are. The same like with AI today, right? I'm teaching AI is a big problem for students, for professors grading papers, but ultimately it will be an issue for writers, right? But for me, I think the answer is kind of easy in the sense of if the readers don't really care whether or not a person in flesh and blood writing this or just a machine kind of compositing things for them, if the readers don't really care, then that's their problem, really. I mean, a problem for publishers and editors, I know. But for me, for now, my answer is, if that's what they want, I guess I can't stop them, right?
Mm.
If that makes sense to you. The same, who you are doing what kind of subject really depends on who your customers are.
Mhm. Let's see. Valerie Waterhouse asks, have your biographies been translated into a Chinese language, Mandarin, I guess, or did you write them originally in a Chinese language? If so, how do they differ? Have they been received differently by Chinese-speaking readers? What can biographies learn from this?
Right. So the answer is yes, they've been translated. So the Charlie Chan book, for instance, initially I'm a translator, right? I was asked by my publishers, both in English and Chinese, like, would you like to do it yourself? I could have done it, but then I resisted. I decided not to for a very simple reason, because I wrote the original book in English. Apparently, I'm targeting, English readers. If I were to write in Chinese, once again, my sentimentality shifts. The way I think, describe the world will change. Inevitably, I have to rewrite so many things, and that's really a pain in the ass. The extra work, not just translating. So I hired, we found a translator, but of course, I had to do so much proofreading, correcting. I thought should have done it myself. As far as the reception is concerned, so and here's interesting. So when the Charlie Chan book came out, and I went to Shanghai, the Chinese edition came out. I went to Shanghai Literary Festival. It was huge, and the book sold really well. And the same editor a few years ago tried to bring out a new edition of the Chinese, Charlie Chan book, and we're almost ready to go to the printer. And she also bought, before the Anime One book came out, she also bought the Chinese rights for the Anime One book as well. And then the internal censor of the publishing house just last year, 2 years ago, killed the Charlie Chan book. That because the political wind shifted in China. A decade ago, everything was fine, but with the Xi, the reason was that there was too much history about Chinese humiliation in America.
Mhm.
The racism against Chinese, they thought Chinese readers should not know more about it. It's just disgraceful and all that. So my editor, the Chinese editor, said, "What about the Anime One book?" And the internal censor, the same thing, unless you cut that off. But if I had to cut off Chinese American history, in telling Charlie Chan's story or Anime One story, there's no Charlie Chan story or Anime One story without the communal history, right? So that's the end of the story, and for now, at least. Um,
I was in preparing for this, and everyone can watch this if they want to. And you know about this, of course, Yunte, but there's this black and white newsreel type footage of Anime Wong visiting Shanghai in 1936, and she's
yes,
coming in and out of the Park Hotel
right, yes.
and wandering around, and it's so evocative, but also which leads me to the bigger question, she was so appealing, so attractive, so graceful. I mean, she's a movie star, she's acting like that, maybe she really was, but it made me wonder, what is your personal feeling about these characters? I mean, Anime Wong, Charlie Chan, the twins. Would you have liked to have known them, for example, personally?
Yeah, personally, I want to be friends with Siamese twins because I think they're really provocative and they know exactly what they're doing. They're very smart. And Charlie Chan, depending which one,
One.
real Charlie Chan, one or all, I can live with him. Actually, he's alcoholic and eventually die alcoholic. I think he's a lot of fun coming from Sweden. Anglicized their names. Animal One, not so much.
Hmm.
Exactly, and that's why I understand her pain in a sense, right? Uh, like one time I was asked by Terry Gross, and when I did a Siamese twins book, and she said, "What question would you ask them? The twins, if you were to meet them today?" It's kind of dull, formulaic question actually, but anyway, um, and in that case, Siamese twins, I wanted to ask them why they never went back to Siam because they were sold by their mother, but all these years became rich and famous, but they never went back to Siam. And for me, that's unthinkable. Like I always, where I grew up, right now I'm writing stories about that small town. And I just went back for my mother's 80th birthday and all that. And that there's always, no matter how far you travel, you're like this, tight. The string kind of, keeps you. Um, with Anime Wong, for instance, despite the fact her glamour, her beauty, her talent, the underlying pain is always there. Okay, so the whole purpose of my writing that book, my mission was to find out what lies underneath that glamour. Okay, what lies underneath. The question I want to ask her if I were to meet her was to like, did you have fun? You have all the show, you're happy, glamour and everything, but did you actually have fun? I know the answer. She actually did not have fun. She couldn't get married, because she was very careful because anti-miscegenation law and everything. And she could date some man, but she said, what's the fun if I can't, get married to them? Yeah. So she has certain limits, and so her story, being born in a Chinese laundry, going to a global star, that distance she traveled, whether or not that person had fun. As a biographer, you can get a sense.
That's fascinating. Well, I think this is the last. Yeah, I have just one last question to sort of bring it full circle from Jack's keynote. He described, and this could be a very American question, but you'll ride with it.
I'm American.
I know you are. Okay, he described biography, he summed up his remarks, biography in these times as a, quote, champion for truth. So given your background, both in China, and now you just told us how the books cannot be published, your books in China at the moment, and now in the US and your own groundbreaking work, would you agree that biography can be a champion for truth?
Oh, absolutely. Exactly for all the reasons I just said, between one time I was asked by a close friend who's a very famous fiction writer. So one day we actually met in Germany on a conference, and he said, Yunte, are you just going to continue to write, biographies? Or meaning, are you going to turn to fiction writing, which is to him a true art of literature? Okay, so kind of looking down upon me. I was a little pissed, but I knew where he came from. So I immediately I bones the pig. That's why I turned to Melville. I said, the fiction writing, and I said, I don't think we need no more fiction in this world right now.
Oh, interesting.
Because fictions, I know I just had read a PhD dissertation prospectus. The student wanted to talk about, Oprah Winfrey in a book club. Of course, any book that got picked by Oprah Winfrey, book club, it's huge for the editor, for the publisher. It's a big deal. But I'm not happy in the sense of the way the books are being discussed. They read fiction no different from, say, they read a biography or read a creative nonfiction or poetry for that matter. And I know I sound like a literature professor, who's kind of have somewhat elitist ways of thinking. But because of what they say about confidence game, narrative is a confidence game, and democracy, reading fiction is a good training for democracy in a sense, because you put yourself in the other's, place, fiction. You become empathetic with the characters. And that's why Plato, many years ago, wanted to ban literature or drama because of these literature's, ability to create this empathy between the audience and the fictional thing going on, and see what kind of mess we get into, right? In terms of politics, how people vote, not based on so-called facts, but based on emotions. And so biography, because of what I call the kind of hybrid genre, it's caught in between. Historians, they think they deal with facts, and just quick notes. So I judged this National Book Award twice in the nonfiction category, and each time we get 500 or 600, submissions. And you can always tell, actually, these creative nonfiction books, whether biographies or not, you can always tell the authors whether they're journalists or they start out as historians or they just writers. I'm not saying which one is the best or better, but you can always tell the way they deal with facts, or the way they digress or want to digress, or journalists oftentimes are impatient, going on the street, go to the facts, and the historians, of course, they forget they need to tell stories. And the writers, forget about them. They're very good at weaving stories in and out. And there's certain amount of risk and a danger. So I think by sticking to this genre, saying biography, we have a goal very clear. We cannot, fictionalize, like earlier Susan warned against us. That because of the constraint, the limits, somewhat actually we are in a better position. I agree with Jack in a sense about truth telling, because we have certain limits. Whereas the fiction, like they say, the writer has the license to lie, and exactly like politicians, they have the license to lie.
Wow. Well, thank you. Whoops, there's one more question here. Steve, sorry. One more question. Do your English Lit students have any interest in biography per se? And how do we promote that?
Yes, life writing. They have a fancy term for it. The life writing, right? They don't call it if you teach biography, like forget it. Like biography, the education with Henry Adams is like autobiography. But life writing, everybody's got excited. Yes, I would promote it as life writing. And I mean, we are still struggling against the genre called a memoir, right? Autobiography, especially now, even worse kind is celebrity memoir. Many of them mostly ghostwritten as well, or very soon AI written. So I think, yeah, let me know if anything I can do to promote, this hybrid genre, really, taking us back to Sima Qian, in Han Dynasty, the poor guy. Yep.
Thank you, Junta, so much. This has been just wonderful. Thank you. Good to see you again. And that was so illuminating. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you for having me, and thank you all.
Thank you.